The difference between rich and poor has always been clear. The rich own the land. The poor, if they have land at all, it's usually thin soil, rough land. And so it was in Ireland long ago. The wealthy owned the good, rich fields, and the poor scraped a living wherever they could. One particular year, it had rained day after day after day, week after week, for months. And the poor who struggled to eke out an existence on shallow soil and rough land found their crops rotting in their little fields. What can we do? They said. We shall starve. So they made soups and gruels from nettles and the seeds of weeds. But still they were going hungry. What can we do? Now Brigit and her sisters, they had been looking for land where they could build a community dedicated to peace and justice and care of the land. And Brigit, when she saw the plight of the poor, sure her heart went out to them. How could she help? Well, sure, herself and her sisters did what they could to alleviate their suffering, but it wasn't enough. Brigit said, I'll go to the king, the highest authority, and I'll ask him for help. Surely he can't refuse. These are his people, after all. So Brigit wrapped herself in her best white woolen cloak, and she went to the king's palace and strode up before him. What will you do, sir? The poor are hungry. They need your help. They need your care. And the king said, Brigit, I have more important things to think about than the poor. Away with you. You do your best. Ask your God to help you. Well, Brigit left. When she returned to her sisters, they set out to beg for help from any wealthy landowners around, and here and there the kinder of them gave bags of oats and grain and greens. And that was all very well. The poor could eat that day or the next. And Brigit thought, aye, give the poor a bag of oats and you feed them for a day or a week, but give them land, good land where they can sow seed, and you feed them into the future. I know what I must do. So once more Brigit wrapped her good wool cloak around her shoulders and she set off to see the king. She strode up before the king and said, the poor need land. Look at all this lush green land that surrounds your palace here. Can't you spare some of that to feed the poor? The king said, no, I need all of my land. But Brigit was persistent this time. She would not back down. At last, the king said, well, Brigit, you do not look so poor and hungry yourself. That is a fine woolen cloak you wear. I tell you what, I promise you I will give you as much land as your cloak will cover. Brigit thanked the king, and he smirked broadly as she walked off out of the palace. Well, Brigit gathered 3 of her sisters, and she removed her white cloak. shook it out and gave each a corner to hold, and she held one herself. "Now, my sisters, pull my cloak tight." And they did, and they held it stretched amongst them. Her sisters wondering, how is this going to help a little tiny patch of land? Now Brigit said, "Now, sisters dear, each of you take one step backwards." And they did. They stepped to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west. And with each step they took, the cloak stretched to fill the space between them. One more step, and another, and another, and another, until the cloak had stretched to cover the whole of the vast plain that today we know as the Curragh of Kildare. Now the king was watching from up in the high tower of his palace. "What is happening here?" It looked as if there had been a sudden snowfall and the whole plain was covered in a mantle of snow. And then he thought, "Oh, Brigit, what magic have you worked here? Or perhaps it is a miracle." And he fell to his knees. As Brigit strode up the aisle of his palace before him. "Well, King, did you see how far my cloak stretched?" "Well, Brigit, I did," said the king, "and I am a man of my word, and I did give my promise, and I will keep it. You may have the land that your cloak covered and share it with the poor. And for luck, I will throw in 100 bags of oat seed for them to plant there." Well, Brigit smiled and bowed low before the king. "I thank you, sir, and the poor, I swear, will be so grateful." And that is the story of how Brigit got land for the poor.